Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity. I first wanted to, if I can, maybe share a link in the chat, because this paper is entitled Tosaka Jun, Laughter in a Time of Tragedy, and it's sort of leftover material from a book that's coming out at the end of December. So this end of this month, I have a forthcoming book. I just wanted to maybe share a link if I can to that. Let me see. And then, yeah, so I'll post that in there. If anyone's interested, I have information on it too. But this is leftover because I was writing this book, which is coming out with Roman and Littlefield, entitled Marx After the Kyoto School, Utopia and the Pure Land. And I wanted to do a book on all of the Kyoto School and their reaction to Marx, but obviously that's an enormous project. And I ended up talking almost entirely about Nishida Kitaro in that book. And I have leftover material from trying to do close readings on Tosaka Jun. A lot of his work still is not translated into English, so it's tough to find a lot of his things. So I found this very interesting piece of writing that he did in the early and mid 1930s on humor and comedy. And if you know the history of Japan, it was not a fun time for academics at that time. So if I might be able to screen share, I'll just read from this paper. It's still something under sort of revision right now. But let me see, how do I do this? And I'll just read, share screen. What am I looking at here? Let's go to this. Share this here. No, that's crazy. That's too much there. Nope, it's not what I wanted to take off. Hang on. Here, okay. So everybody can see this now, or yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Tosaka Jun, Laughter in a Time of Tragedy. Nobody really knows who said it first, but it is apparent that the idea has circulated from at least the time of Ballio counseling Plautus on the subject of his plays, when he advised him that the plebes will forgive being lashed if you can make them laugh. Plautus is often credited with being the first writer of theatrical comedies. His most well-known recurring character trope was that of the clever slave. And this line from Ballio makes its ways into the phraseology of Oscar Wilde, who's credited with making the remark, "If you tell the people the truth, you must put it in the form of a joke, or else the people are likely to kill you." Nobody is ever just joking. Jokes are always deadly serious, and within the discourses that evoke laughter, there are always norms beyond which the joke is carried from comedy into the realm of the tragic. This is what is at stake in the philosophy of humor in the work of Tosaka Jun. And there's this timeline there. So, who is a member of the Kyoto School and was a student of Nishida Kitaro and Tanabe Hajime. And along with Miki Kiyoshi, these are the two philosophers within the early Kyoto School who were most sympathetic to the writings of Karl Marx, although in many ways with a careful and critical eye towards the texts of Marx. What I'm looking at here are a series of texts written by Tosaka Jun, written in the early 1930s, collected and published in 1936 under the title Laughter, Comedy, and Humor. And it's in the text Shiso Toshite no Bungaku, or Literature as Thought, as well as his work at the time on the function of policing and a few untranslated works on philosophy and ideology. So Tosaka's dialectic of comedy and tragedy, Nami, or the wave. So provocative thesis forwarded by Tosaka Jun in his brilliant trilogy of essays, Laughter, Comedy, and Humor, is that Hegel, Marx, and Lenin were superb humorists. Superb dialecticians such as Hegel, Marx, and Lenin were invariably superb critics, is a direct quote from Tosaka Jun's essay. These superb critics were the virtuoso discoverers of paradox and masters of irony and humor. And it is also probably true that they were superb theoretical writers of comedy. It is characteristic of established theoreticians that, along with the skill for metaphor, which is one level of the dialectical talent, they also excel at banter. So when I read that, I thought, no one ever thinks of Marx as a humorist, or Lenin, or, if you're reading Hegel's Science of Logic, it's not filled with all these jokes. There are a lot of puns in it, but you wouldn't think of it as a work of comedy. So that caught my attention right there. How is he looking at comedy? Comedy exists in a dialectical relation towards our sense of the tragic. Tosaka's theses shift comedy from its typical terrain as entertainment into the realm of resistance. It also shifts the way that one might imagine a typical sort of left-wing activist today, especially in this day and age, as sort of tragic narcissistic figure who's constantly offended and creating a seemingly endless list of sort of puritanical rules with which the world is supposed to adhere. In America, now it's called political correctness or cancel culture, which is a whole other thing. But Tosaka's reflections on comedy hope to foster a revitalization of the politics of joy, akin to the brilliant introduction to the Anti-Oedipus written by Deleuze and Guattari, published much later and written by Michel Foucault. I see echoes of this sentiment from Tosaka Jun in what Michel Foucault writes in the introduction there. Do not think that one has to be sad in order to be militant, even though the thing one is fighting is abominable. It is the connection of desire to reality, and not its retreat into the forms of representation that possesses revolutionary force. So that's from Michel Foucault, but I think Tosaka Jun is saying something similar, parallel wavelength there. Tosaka's endeavor to expose the absurdism of power can be seen if one reads his work on the police function. The difference between a gang and a police function is an absurd distinction in his work. If the violence of the police is supposed to prevent violence, which is actually a symptom of class conflict, then gangs are viewed as illegitimate, police are legitimate use of violence, but the absurdity is that the only way that police differ from gangs is that the police protect the hegemonic class, the propertied class, whereas gangs enact violence from a position of destitution. So there's a politics there. Who's giving the acceptable police function and then who is deviating or criminal. Obviously, people being taken away in the middle of the night by fascist police is no laughing matter. The reprehension one has when one presumes to laugh is that there is no awareness of the absurdity of the police function when one propagates the act of policing as if it were a legitimate act rather than a farce. The only difference between a gang and a police function is the difference in material class. According to Jun, he writes a very eloquent essay on this right at the peak of totalitarianism in Japan in the early and mid 1930s. He writes a lot of these things, and turning to the topic of humor at that time seems a little bit strange, but there's a very pointed political attack that he was making at that time. On a meta-political level, comedy consists of a multitude of micro-political transactions and dialectical processes grounded in material conditions. As the postmodern cultural turn emphasizes this overdetermination of ideology through cultural production rather than an economic reductionist form of cultural analysis. Tosaka's work reveals that the efficacy of most jokes entails a connection of a desire to reality, especially if the connection is concealed on what he calls, this is his term, the backside. And I say backside of a social signifier. Class conflict may be concealed in the backside of a cultural production and rendered apparent in a joke that presses this antagonism of class conflict into the service of a liberatory struggle. So even if this struggle is only expressed at a discursive level, so saying a joke using words, Tosaka's technical view of humor is akin to sort of Gramscian war of position. So this means that culture can be a key component in changing popular attitudes in order to build sympathy for sort of class consciousness through discursive measures such as comedy. And I'll just give a brief summary of this if you're not familiar. There's an Italian communist philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who distinguished between a war of maneuver, which is an open conflict between classes, where the workers attempt to take hold of the modes of production and the levers of power via the state. But on the other hand, Gramsci offers an alternative option of a war of position, where there's hegemonic power in the culture, and it can play a key role in building sympathy for various revolutionary ideologies or whatever, shifting the cultural apparatus of the ideological structure. And so jokes, I think, in Tosaka Jun sort of resonate at that level. They can popularize sentiment in the culture that brings sympathy to oppressed people. And so there's always a way that popular forms of communication are a reaction to the shifting tides of material conditions. And in one of the lesser sort of focal points of Tosaka Jun's work. At least I think it's a central concept in a lot of his work, but a lot of people that write about him don't focus on this. Tosaka refers to nami, or sort of a wave or an undulation of a flow or a movement of a mass. And I think he's doing this specifically in a way of looking at culture as and truth as sort of an interconnected flow of water as a metaphor, rather than sort of, it gives a similarity between this sort of war of maneuver that Gramsci's talking about. So if totalitarian regimes attempt to enforce a conservative social order, this authoritarian power will collapse eventually, because the development of the means of production will always sort of clash, this sort of a Marxist interpretation of this, will always clash with the antiquated social relations, which cannot be enforced as developments and relations of production that are correlatively linked with developments in social relations. Marx writes about this throughout his work, but as falling rate of profit occurs, there's a need for capital to keep inventing new technologies and mechanisms of production, but that always revolutionizing of technology also revolutionizes social relations and social production, which then creates a different sort of revolutionizing of culture as well. So the need for conservatives to go back to the past, or they're sort of fighting against their own capitalist economic interests in that regard. So eventually this creates a contradiction that can't be sustained. And so anyway, the historical materialist thesis in the subtext of Tosaka Jun's definition of tragedy is always in comparison to comedy. And he says, quote, "The word history," and he uses the German Geschichte, as well as the word destiny, Schicksal, are related to things sent, Schicken, things conferred by the gods. And so with the result in modernity being, and I think he's criticizing this in a way, history is interpreted as a gradual unfolding of character development, overcoming tragedies of character in terms of a biographical development, bios, developing personal character as sort of like a discovery of your essence and an unfolding into, your character is playing a part in the history as if it's a theater or something like that, and you find your essence and you know your role in the script. So that's the form of history that I think he's criticizing as a tragic form of history. Bios as the uses of logo in the context of a personal narrative of the self. In other words, modernity is presumed that you would allegedly write your own story. Your life is a work of an unfolding story in which you are the main character, as if life were a theatrical performance. Okay, so history is conceptually inextricable from tragedy, or the sense that one is living out a fate that cannot be changed because it was created by the gods, as if our moral character is already scripted from above. Whereas in escaping the constraints placed on life as interpreted as a historical tragedy, historical necessity, and biographical development of character is replaced with a sort of theoretical necessity. And this is an important shift where there's some, Tosaka Jun defines this in a very kind of technical way, the difference between historical and theoretical necessity, which can only be approached through the freedom of comedy and spontaneity. Tosaka's thesis is clear. Tragedy and history are linked as sort of fatalistic philosophies, whereas comedy as a theoretical necessity opens up the future to contingency of unforeseen possibilities, because these possibilities are concealed on the reverse side of what appears. He keeps talking about flipping from the front side to the back side in these essays, if you read them. Tosaka's thesis is that humor takes the affirmative and regulates it to the negative, so it flips it. And irony takes the negative side and regulates it to the affirmative. Irony is sort of a reversion in a way. And so he breaks down, and I think it's a interesting distinction that he makes, and it's very important the way he uses this. He flips these kanji characters, and the way that he writes about this, the wording of it is very specific. He uses the word ranri and riran, and he inverts it intentionally, I think. Logic, which is often viewed as, in the terms of Tetsugaku, as logic, can be tragic or comic, but only comedy can really be a theory or riran. And so what does he mean by this? I think if we look at Tosaka Jun's work in other areas, he tends to posit a very nuanced difference between two styles of Tetsugaku, that of Ranri, or logic, and Riran, or theory. The logical importance of comedy is a social logic, that is the sort of historical materialist view. Comedy is the anthem of the village, which he echoes in his writings. Whereas the framework that structures tragedy must be history, or a historical necessity. And when tragedy is separated from its historicality, then it has lost the pressure that makes it tragic. If this historical necessity is completely replaced by theoretical necessity, then it goes into the realm, it becomes the world of comedy. There are always set coordinates to tragedy. There's always a framework that structures tragedy. So the sense of, if you watch a play or you experience a work of art as tragic, it always does so, according to Tosaka Jun, it always does so within the coordinates of a set framework that defines it as such. Whereas comedy typically transgresses the coordinates that structure tragedy. Therefore, comedy can provoke laughter on the basis of a social logic. It can land within the coordinates, or it can strike a humorous tone through theory, in the sense that a joke can break free of the coordinates that structure ordinary social logic. Oftentimes, a good comedian does that intentionally, but you know that he's or she is joking to transgress those boundaries in a playful way. So it breaks out of the framework of what is sort of typical social norms. Whereas tragedy can only make sense as tragedy within the coordinates of the framework that structures it historically. So Tosaka Jun's example, it's, I think, trying to be a little bit flippant in the middle of this, as one of these essays that he writes. He uses the example of Hamlet. If someone were to observe Hamlet, say from the perspective of someone who doesn't believe in that tragic sense, say from an atheistic perspective, or someone who doesn't believe that history is the unfolding of a tragic sort of characteristic given to us by the gods, you would look at this feeling that Hamlet has of his sort of tragic destiny in the play and think, that's absurd, it's silly, why is he acting that way? So it immediately becomes an absurdist comedy, because you're approaching it from a perspective outside of those coordinates of what maybe Shakespeare may have intended or not. So the tragic tone simply resonates as an absurd farce, hence the tone of texts left by Hegel, Marx, and Lenin is read by Tosaka Jun through this absurdist lens. That is, without the coordinates of a sort of messianic structure that frames the question of history in terms of historical necessity. The philosophies appear as exposing a sort of cosmic absurdity of the, and I use this in a sort of feudalistic sense, the class conflict of lord, bourgeoisie, in the case of Tosaka Jun's time, the sort of fascist leader that took itself far too seriously. So the difference between logic and theory would be a difference of desired ends. Logic desires the closure of a conclusion as its end, to get to the conclusion, to find the essence of the, whatever the answer is. Whereas theory desires an openness of free play and futurity as clearing. I think I'm using that in the Heideggerian sense there. Hence, we understand this, we can open up a new hermeneutics of sort of communistic idea. If we go back to the text of Marx, maybe it wasn't so closed in what was the telos of that project. So in the famous line, first it's tragedy, the closure of the project that desires a communist ontology as a reified object, like this is what the communist project was, and then it's all said and done. Once the project has failed, we can sort of see the second phase as an open-ended farce in the realm of comedy, where the project desires an open-ended futurity as clearing. And I think you see that in a lot of political theorists on the left that are still trying to keep this idea of Marxism alive. You know, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, and a lot of their work is not trying to define communism as this or that, but to keep it open-ended. So there's a lot of people still working on that now. But Tosaka Jun has an interesting thesis here. He defines very clearly 3 types of humor. And he says comedy should expose the abuses of power that are concealed on the backside of the culture. So that's what makes a good joke. It explodes sort of what is repressed or hidden from the people. Oftentimes a joke you spontaneously react without realizing it, but it's something that everybody can relate to because it's something felt in the background of the culture at that time. In the sense that there are three different types of humor. Tosaka's account of humor presents an account of political power bound to the people themselves. It's sort of a hegemonic strategy that favors those on the periphery. So as is well known, Tosaka Jun outlines this history very briefly in these essays. Humor originated as a term in ancient times that indicated various types of fluids in the body. It was a disease that had to be released or something that was imbalanced. Hence, I think he uses that sense of humor as going back to his version of movement as a wave or a sort of liquid or a flow to the movement of culture. So Tosaka's thesis is that this etymology, as absurd as it might sound, still refers to the types of humors that excite and impact the body. This is a quote that I pulled out and put into bold here. There are humors that are methods of escape. There are humors that stabilize or centralize infinitude. I think that's a very existential way that he looks at that there, and bring a sense of closure, hence a logic to comedy, but not a theory there. Situating the uncertain and ambiguous. So that's one form of humor. Then, this is the more radical type of humor that he's looking at. There are humors that serve as a centripetal force, where the outside flows into the center, flushing away any substantial sense of centralized power. So forms of humor serve as liquids that sort of flow, again, this wave theory of flow, that flow in from the margins. You think of like a whirlpool. The center is opening up into a nothing, but the outside is flowing into it. That would be a form of humorous comedy where it favors the margins into the center to sort of flush away the power. So there could be a renewal to the joke senses a sort of marginality that pulls people who are powerless into the middle. And a swirling centripetal force is a kind of wave that carries away the centrality of power. In a way, the water and wave flows from the margins into the center, and the wave swirls around as it hollows out the center. There's a sort of particular kind of wave or political ripple effect that occurs through this centripetal force of particular types of humor. And then so in the latter part of this chapter, I look more at existential. I think he is looking, I try to focus on Marx, but then I also look at Schopenhauer's theory of laughter, and Kierkegaard actually has a few wonderful little anecdotes in some of his work that I think exemplify Tosaka Jun's thesis on humor. So in a way, the joke does not tell us the meaning of life as if to sort of convey a logic where the answer is closed off and now we know what the meaning is. This is my own little inversion here. Comedy deconstructs the life of meaning to reveal the anti-essentialist hollowness at the core of existence by releasing the pent-up humors. That is, instead of finding the meaning of life, we reveal the end of the life of meaning, which is more of a existential way of looking at the power of comedy. That is, it opens up to the nothingness or the hollowness.